Welcome to our program today, Supremacist Theological Entanglements, Christianity, Supersessionism, Racism, and Islamophobia. I should begin by saying that I was fortunate enough to read the article from which this talk will be given, and it was groundbreaking. And so I was delighted that I could arrange today to have Axel Mark Oakes Taxex, assistant professor in the Department of Religion at Seton Hall, join us. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Interreligious Studies, completed his doctorate at Harvard Divinity School in Comparative Interreligious Theology, Islamic Studies, and Catholic Theology in 2019. And that background comes through, and you'll see today in the talk, it comes through in his article. As a constructive theologian, his scholarship aims to read pre-modern sources as resources to contemporary questions. Contemporary concerns of Islamophobia, racism, and late capitalism inform a lot of his research in the field of interreligious theology and studies. He's published in the Journal of Sufi Studies, the Journal of Moral Theology, and Horizons. His article is forthcoming very soon, and is a contributor to the Georgetown Companion to Interreligious Studies and the Brill Companion to Comparative Theology. Welcome, Axel. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And I first want to convey my special gratitude toward you, John Esposito, and Georgetown University's Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding for sponsoring this event. It's an honor and a pleasure to be invited to discuss this very important topic. Supremacist theological entanglements. These three words require some unpacking. By supremacist, I mean the ideological belief in which a certain group of people or a discursive tradition is deemed superior to all others or strives to remain superior to all others. Of course, today this ideology has morphed into a monster in which global supremacy is sought through economic and military supremacy. More on this later. Supremacist theology in the Christian context is understood as a theological position that places the Christian way of life over, above, and superior to all other religious traditions, implicitly or explicitly. Supremacist theological entanglements is an expression denoting the knot of intersecting supremacisms that becomes larger and tighter over time, a knot that contains early Christian replacement theology and supersessionism, medieval anti-Judaism and anti-Islamic theology, early modern and modern racism, Orientalism, modern anti-Semitism, white supremacy, Western supremacy, and today, as I already mentioned, forms of global economic and military supremacy, the two main players of which are the United States and China. Finally, let me define another major topic of this talk, Islamophobia. In the American context, Islamophobia accurately reflects a social anxiety toward Islam and Muslim cultures that is largely unexamined by, yet deeply ingrained in Americans. This phobia results from distant social experiences that mainstream American culture has perpetuated in popular memory, which are in turn buttressed by a similar understanding of current events. This anxiety relies on a sense of otherness, despite many common sources of thought. So Islamophobia emerges from the unexamined yet deeply ingrained social anxiety toward Islam and Muslims, and within not only those distant social experiences, but also the symbols, narratives, metaphors, and language that have produced and sustained this anxiety historically and contemporarily, say Christian supremacist theology or modern Orientalism. Now, outside of the Euro-American context, however, Islamophobia characterizes, I argue, the current global economic, military, and political supremacies that disproportionately and negatively impact societies of Muslims worldwide in North America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, South and Southeast Asia, China, and more. So Islamophobia today is similar in theory and function and purpose to racism, and sustains and perpetuates negatively evaluated meaning about Muslims and Islam in our contemporary setting. As an ideology or social imaginary, it operates covertly more often than overtly, by shaping and determining the shared languages and conceptual maps that inform and construct thinking about Muslims and Islam as other. Most importantly, for a person, community, or system to be Islamophobic, the acknowledged Muslim or Islamic element that is present doesn't have to be explicit and overt, but it can be implicit and covert, or merely even nuanced through meanings that are theological, social, cultural, racial, economic, and so on, that at times never even necessarily name or identify Muslims or Islam. Given this, uncovering Islamophobia in contemporary political and theological discourse requires careful analysis because the Islamophobic elements are often hidden under layers of economic, political, and social discourses and systems that have removed any mention of Islam or Muslims. In summary, today we need to think about Islamophobia in a global context in a similar way we think about racism in a global context. Global economic structures have been characterized by Black studies scholars as neocolonial racial capitalism. Today, given the ways in which societies of Muslims globally are placed between China and Euro-North American nations in a race for global supremacy, we can also say that our economic structures are neocolonial, Islamophobic, and racial capitalism. Given the theological purview of this talk, however, I focus on the Christian shared languages and conceptual maps that have produced and perpetuated Islamophobia in language and systems. The contemporary state and historical genealogy of Islamophobia parallels that of anti-Semitism. Just as early Christian theological anti-Judaism influenced the later racist phenomena of anti-Semitism, likewise has earlier Christian anti-Islamic theology influenced the later racist phenomena of Islamophobia. However, I connect these parallel discourses and make a tentative case for sourcing Islamophobia even further back, namely in the general Christian supremacist vision that began with replacement theology and supersessionism. Thus, the source of Islamophobia is the same as the source of anti-Semitism, the same as modern racism and neocolonial racial capitalism. So to understand Islamophobia, we thus must understand the racialization of religion, a process that began, I argue, even further back than the 15th to 19th century limpieza de sangre system of early modern Spain and Portugal, and the European colonization of North America from Haiti to Turtle Island. Let us recall that limpieza de sangre, which means cleanliness of blood, was a system of racist discrimination meant to distinguish so-called old Christians from those Christians who had converted from Islam or Judaism. We see origins of blood purity in the modern concept of racism here. However, we need to go further back to understand Islamophobia as a form of racism that stems from Christian supersessionism. Ultimately, I suggest that the contemporary Islamophobia needs to be understood as first, the necessary outcome of a Christian supersessionist theology. Islamophobia is thus constituted and conceptualized by previous forms of Christian supersessionist and racist theological imaginaries and systems, from replacement theology to anti-Semitism, modern racism, and so on. Second, contemporary Islamophobia needs to be understood as a global phenomenon that has taken on political language absent of explicit supremacist theological thinking. By this, I mean that today, nation states from the United States to China deploy Islamophobia, not in the rhetoric of theological supremacy, but rather in the language of the war on terror, settlements, cultural assimilation, economic development, nation building, women saving, the Belt and Roads Initiative, and so on. Islamophobia in this case becomes the collateral damage of either the protection of the homeland or economic development and debt trap diplomacy, by which I mean a situation where a powerful lending country or institution, say China or the IMF, seeks to saddle a borrowing nation with debt to increase its leverage over it. In short, the 21st century world has complicated the analysis of Islamophobia as a form of supremacy precisely because it has become embedded in global structures and systems and policies, and ultimately in our economic and political logics. Finally, it should be evident that I'm analyzing Islamophobia as a social, political, and economic ideology that is backed by state power and global systems, and not so much as an individual implicit or explicit bias against Muslims or Islam, though the presence of individual anti-Muslim bias or bigotry only perpetuates Islamophobic systems. Let me give some background. As I explored the wealth of truly brilliant and critical scholarship on Islamophobia, from Junaid Raina to Sophia Rose Arjana, Mustafa Bayoumi, Mahmoud Mandani, Todd Green, and so on, I noticed a pattern. They sourced and analyzed contemporary Islamophobia in various medieval and early modern contexts: the Crusades, the limpieza de sangre system, and later looming threat of Ottoman Empire, early modern and modern Orientalism, racism, and of course the 20th and 21st century United States foreign policy in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, domestic surveillance and security apparatuses, concerning the racialized Muslim subject in the homeland post 9/11. Now, all this is true, but as a Catholic theologian, I wondered, how did we get here? And how Christian theological discourse, words, symbols, narratives, logics, and metaphors, all of which constituted a supremacist theology of religions for centuries, I wondered how all of this might have contributed to the story of Islamophobia, as Junaid Rana calls it. Rana skillfully argues how the Muslim was constructed both as a threat to white Christian supremacy and in relation to anti-Jewish racism. This racial logic constructed the Muslim as a racialized subject under Euro-American regimes of power, precisely because race and religion commingled in the formation of modernity. This 14-year-old essay remains required reading for anyone seeking to understand contemporary Islamophobia in the United States. In particular, Rana writes, quote, "From conquest of the New World to the transatlantic slave trade, Islam figured as an important aspect of the early formation of the US racial formation across a Black and brown Atlantic. Resurrecting this genealogy complicates the history and formation of the race concept, revealing a complex and overlapping racialization of racial categories such as Black and brown with religious categories such as Islam and Muslim. The racialization of Islam emerged from the Old World, was placed on the New World, indigenous peoples, and subsequently took on a continued significance in relation to Black America and the world of Muslim immigrants. Thus, the category of Muslim in the US is simultaneously a religious category and one that encompasses a broad race concept that connects a history of Native America to Black America to immigrant America in the consolidation of anti-Muslim racism," end quote. However, once again, as a Catholic theologian, I asked, what if we began the story of Islamophobia even further back? What if, in an analytical move many may find strange, we began the story of Islamophobia before Islam ever entered the scene? What theological categories and concepts might have made Christian soil fertile ground for the cultivation of Islamophobia? A primary driver of this exploration was the assertion that theologies of the past remain the politics of the present. By this, I mean that contemporary permutations of political, racial, social, and even personal Islamophobia may find their source not merely in medieval Christian anti-Islamic theologies, but even further back, early Christian anti-Judaism and replacement theology. The analytical advantage of beginning the story of Islamophobia before Islam ever entered the historical scene is the following. It gives the tools to understand how discourses and systems today remain Islamophobic, even when the explicit mention of Islam or Muslims is lacking. We then can understand how our current global economic structure remains Islamophobic, even when it reads as religiously or racially neutral. In the remainder of this talk, I will give a summary of this theological genealogy of Islamophobia and then take a practical turn. How is awareness of this genealogy beneficial for praxis? That is, what does this mean for Catholic scholarship, education, and practice regarding a Catholic theology of Islam and interreligious dialogue with communities of Muslims? What is the universal responsibility Catholic institutions have in undoing the discursive harm that past theologies have had on our contemporary global politics and economic structures of supremacy? Throughout, I am not suggesting that some non-Christian or non-Western political and theological traditions and movements did not have ambitions of empire. Of course, some did, many did. However, what I am suggesting is that perhaps those ambitions were not rooted in ideologies of theological and racial supremacy. Let us recall that by 1914, Europeans and their descendants had conquered 84% of the earth. One does not accidentally or unintentionally stumble upon this sort of hegemony. While ideologies of theological and racial supremacy may not be the sufficient cause for such global domination, they certainly are the necessary feature of it. One might even say they are the condition for the possibility of global domination. These ideologies then restructured the entire global political order into the 21st century. So let us begin the story of Islamophobia before Islam with early Christian supersessionism and replacement theology, which formed in part anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. The interpretation of the good news of Jesus Christ that became dominant, especially once allied with empire, is called Christian replacement theology or supersessionism. Replacement theology is the early Christian teaching that the new covenant of Jesus Christ not only fulfilled, but entirely replaced the old covenant between Yahweh and the Jewish people. It places the Christian tradition on a pedestal over the Jewish people. Accordingly, the role of the Jews within Christian theology was a soteriological foil to underscore Christian supremacy. Supersessionism is the belief that the Christian message, the New Covenant, superseded the Jewish message, the Old Covenant. Nevertheless, I'm suggesting that it's morphed into the oftentimes unuttered belief that the Christian religion, particularly of white Europeans, supersedes all other religious and cultural traditions, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, indigenous, and even Oriental Orthodox Christianities, whether they emerged before or after the Christian covenant. Christian supersessionism is a theological doctrine, only different in degree to Christian supremacy, which itself then became a theopolitical stance of Western white supremacy. In other words, supersessionism gave birth to a far more comprehensive supremacist theology. Following this genealogy, supersessionism is thus directly constitutive of the ideology of Islamophobia, conceived theologically, socially, or politically. Replacement theology and Christian supersessionism made it nearly impossible for Christians to encounter Muslims and Islam in a way that was not supremacist. In some cases, Islam was portrayed as a regression, either to Jewish teachings or to heresies thought to have been destroyed. As such, Christianity supersedes Islam because Islam was conceived as a backward or regressive religion. In other words, Islam was conceptualized as a threat or inferior to Christianity in terms of theological doctrines and practices. And Muslims were presented as racially inferior. And as such, Christian supremacy informs these discursive characterizations as we move into medieval anti-Islamic theology and Christian polemics in the context of Islamic expansion. So far we had the prehistory. The story of Islamophobia before Islam in the Christian context is one of Christian theological supremacy. As we move into the medieval period after the historical emergence of Islam, Christian thinkers needed to categorize Muslims into one of a collection of enemies of Christ. The medieval Christian worldview did not permit the possibility that other religious traditions could be physically or spiritually beneficial on their own merit. Pre-Islamic Christian typologies of the religious other informed Christian conceptions of Muhammad, Muslims, and Islam. And those typologies were all largely based on either a supersessionist or supremacist vision. Furthermore, medieval Christian discourse on Islam or Muslims, terms rarely used until the 16th century, were mostly ethnic, such as Arabs, Turks, Moors, and Saracens. The racialization of religion is thus not merely a modern process. In the medieval period, three discourses therefore come together. First, the discourse on Christian conflict with Islam. Second, the categorization of Muslims as enemies of the church or enemies of Christ. And third, the descriptions of Muslims in ethnic terms. Indeed, just as the medieval Christian worldview did not permit the possibility that other religious traditions could be beneficial on their own merit, likewise today, Western systems and worldviews do not permit the possibility that non-Euro-American or indigenous social, cultural, economic systems and worldviews could be effective, even better, alternatives to our modern global political and economic systems. The elite and popular literary depictions of Islamic misbelief and malpractices and of polemical images of Muhammad were part of a larger medieval Christian theological position regarding Islam. The Christian gospel was final and universal, and so all other beliefs and practices were a threat to the Christian supremacy. Christian adjacent traditions, like the Jewish and Islamic, were in a way more of a menace, given their proximity geographically, biblically, and theologically. In short, Islam, Muslims, and Muhammad were represented as inordinately sensual, unusually violent, shrewdly spreading lies of backward desert provenance, irrational, illogical, and so on. And this is all part of both elite and popular depictions circulating Christian Europe into the 13th century. Once again, our imaginations need not be stretched at all to see the source of early modern and modern constructions of the Arab and the Muslim as religious fanatic, terrorist, regressive, and despiser of all things righteous and rational. Because the ideological responses to Islam forged in the 13th century were reused and anthologized and translated and published into the Enlightenment and modern period. It may not be appropriate to label anti-Islamic theology as supersessionist, but certainly supersessionist theology is at least the necessary, though not sufficient, cause of anti-Islamic theology, precisely because supersessionist thinking begot Christian supremacy. The anti-Muslim discourses of the Middle Ages provided key theoretical underpinnings for European Christian hegemony over those who are non-Christian, and it must be added, over those who are non-white. The ideology, the words, symbols, narratives, literary depictions, theologies that rendered Islam a danger to Christianity and perceived irrational and lustful Muslims as a source of terror to Christians pervaded the social and public imaginaries of Christians and Europeans into the present day. Medieval accounts of Islam form an important foundation, comprising an entire tradition of polemical misrepresentations for the attitudes taken later by early modern theologians, both Protestant and Catholic. As if to foreshadow the good Muslim, bad Muslim trope of the 21st century that demands Muslims assimilate socially into European, American, or Han Chinese culture, early modern Orientalist narratives depicted bad Muslims as defeated, dead, or captured, and good Muslims as converts to Christianity. What is unique about this period between the medieval and the modern is that Christian powers were in fact deeply threatened by Islamic wealth, power, and cultural superiority. Europeans had real anxieties about the imminent threat of Muslim Ottoman forces. This is true. However, 2 points may be drawn from the early modern period. The first is that these Western Christian representations of Muhammad, Muslims, and Islam were maintained, if not amplified, in modern Orientalist discourse, racism, and contemporary Islamophobia. The second, suggested by Alan Mikhail's recent book, is that the threat of Islam and Muslims fueled the colonization of the Americas. Quote, Islam was the mold that cast the history of European racial and ethnic thinking in the Americas, as well as the history of warfare in the Western Hemisphere. There is thus a nearly unbroken link from medieval anti-Islamic theology to the contemporary discourses of Orientalism and racism, and thus Islamophobia. While the early modern period is complicated by political and military rise of the Ottoman Empire, the supremacist vision of Christian theology remains the necessary, if not sufficient, cause of the West's totalizing venture of universal supremacy, and Islamophobia remains this venture's crucial tool. One last note before proceeding. Medieval, late medieval, and early modern societies of Muslims and Islamic discourses did have racialized conceptions that fueled the Arab slave trade in Africa. However, as scholar Kahinda Andrews notes in his recent book, The New Age of Empire, it was really only the West that found its prosperity and global domination by exploiting racism to the fullest through chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. The Christian story of Islamophobia thus continues, from its prehistory in terms of Christian supremacy and anti-Judaism to its origins in medieval anti-Islamic theology and early modern Orientalism. The story proceeds into modern Orientalism and racism. Modern anti-Semitism and modern Islamophobia share the same genealogy. However, over time, the Christian sources of Islamophobia become obscured. Modern Orientalism and racism do not explicitly deploy theological language in the same way. These pre-modern sources of Islamophobia constructed our modern political and economic systems, from colonialism and imperialism to present-day neo-colonial racial capitalism, global military domination, and the security and surveillance state. Orientalism itself is a form of supremacy. Edward Said wrote, quote, the idea of European identity as superior one in comparison with all non-European peoples and cultures is a major component of European culture. There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness. Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing the relative upper hand. So in the transition from late medieval anti-Islamic theology to early modern and modern Orientalism and racism, it becomes increasingly difficult to disentangle the political discourses producing European superiority over Oriental backwardness from theological Christian supremacy. However, this theopolitical entanglement is in fact the point presently being argued. The influence of medieval anti-Islamic theology is not restricted to academic scholarship, but part and parcel of the popular imagination. Islamophobia in the past was reproduced through plays, poems, novels, short stories, news articles, sermons, travel journals, public lectures, artwork, and more. And today it's reproduced digitally from blogs to podcasts and from videos to social media posts and popular books, movies, TV shows, and even given a public platform to influential political figures and think tanks, all of which has been termed the Islamophobia industry. Now, Said gestured toward the connection between Western anti-Semitism and the Islamic branch of Orientalism. He called Orientalism a strange secret sharer of Western anti-Semitism. There's been some scholarly headway seeking to connect Christian theology to Orientalism and anti-Semitism to Islamophobia, but not so much through the lens of theological supersessionism and supremacy, which I'm seeking to do in order to provide a framework for specifically anti-Islamophobic theological praxis. We must underscore the entanglement of Christian supremacy with Orientalism, modern racism, and Islamophobia. In this regard, I disagree slightly with Talal Asad. There is a continuity between medieval theology and modern secularism, and Islamophobia is one example of that continuity. Orientalism may be defined as the study of the geographical land, people, cultures, societies, and religions east of Europe. However, this study was a tool for the European and eventual USA geopolitical goal of dominating that very same land. It was rarely ever an unbiased affair, but one shaped by the preconceived aim of discursively producing the East, and in this specific case, the Islamic and the Muslim, as worthy of, if not requiring, domination or salvation. For Orientalist discourse, the West represented the East in a manner similar to how Christians represented Muslims in medieval anti-Islamic theology. For the most part, Orientalists represented the Arab and the Muslim as either a threat, fanatic or terrorist, or culturally and religiously inferior, legalist or irrational mystic. Shifting our gaze from pre-modern and modern Europe to the contemporary United States, it's unarguable that Islam and Muslims are encountered, studied, and presented to the public imagination in a way that is near a direct descendant of Orientalism and Christian conceptions of Islam. Western or white Christian supremacy morphed into American supremacy. The historical and theological discourses of early and medieval Christian supersessionism, anti-Judaism, and then anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic theology formed the necessary and constitutive parts of Islamophobia today. This Islamophobia is now a tool in the larger global race for economic and military supremacy. And I suggest that currents of Christian supremacist theology are predominantly the cause of Islamophobia. The European and Christian theologies of the past remain the global politics of the present. Islamophobia is a discursive and systemic tool for global supremacy. I've suggested that the genealogy of Islamophobia in reverse historical order is modern racism, Orientalism, anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Islamic theology, anti-Judaism, and finally replacement theology. If this is the case, then Catholic theology has wittingly and unwittingly sustained or produced anti-Islamic discourse. It should then be a pressing task of Catholic theologians, educators, church hierarchy, and institutions of higher education to undo this discursive harm. The urgency is even greater in the third decade of the 21st century. I've occasionally alluded to this already. We see that Islamophobia has structured our entire global economic system. Muslim-majority nation states remain disproportionately and negatively impacted by the current Western and Chinese competition for global economic supremacy. Whether it's the war on terror rhetoric, military interventions, debt trap diplomacy, neocolonial extractive capitalism, the surveillance state, the plight of the Palestinian people, or otherwise, Islamophobia has so structured our contemporary global systems that undoing the knot of supremacist entanglements appears impossible without cutting up all the strings and starting from scratch, to belabor the metaphor. We live in a neocolonial, racial, and Islamophobic capitalist world. So what do we do? A Catholic community entering in any form of interreligious engagement at the local lay level or in academia must address this history directly. It is not sufficient to ignore or forget it, or merely state, well, we're not like that anymore, or I'm not personally responsible. While not seeking to restrict present action to the guilt of the past, it must be borne in mind that historical events have present-day legacies. The present remains shaped by the past. Catholics must not only disavow the detrimental supremacist theologies and practices of the past that were enacted in the name of Christ, but also acknowledge that even in the secular, civil, and political sphere, we live under this legacy to this day. Once again, the European and Christian theology of the past remain the global politics of the present, and these theologies have shaped not just political discourse, but global economic systems. Paul Hedges, in his recent book entitled Religious Hatred, analyzes the global interconnected histories of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. In section 4 of his book, he explores contemporary anti-Semitism and Islamophobia beyond the West. He has a chapter on Islamic anti-Semitism in the context of Palestine and the occupied territories, on Buddhist Islamophobia in the Burmese, Thai, and Sri Lankan context, and on Hindu Islamophobia in the South Asian context. In all three cases, we notice a pattern. Contemporary forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia outside the West emerge after the colonial encounter with the West. Finally, we can add a case not included in Hedge's book, the repression and cultural, if not physical, genocide of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, China, under the Chinese Communist Party. Just watch any English language CGTN news show about the treatment of Uyghur Muslims, and you'll see war on terror rhetoric, economic development, and cultural assimilation deployed to mask the patently Islamophobic policies of the Chinese government and to justify their arguably genocidal actions. At the risk of over-theorizing, the genealogical sources of contemporary Islamophobia are found in the Christian colonizing West. Now, to be sure, ingredients for religious and racial hatred are obviously found in all religious and cultural traditions. Prejudice, bias, social identity formation, and the creation of in-groups and out-groups are innate to human societies, human affect, cognition, and social behavior as such. But we see a curious pattern. It's only after an encounter with the colonizing West that modern forms of global Islamophobia and anti-Semitism emerge. And it is Western Islamophobic rhetoric that is used to this day to justify the global mistreatment of Muslims from Palestine to Xinjiang province. Even some Arab and Muslim majority nations use Western Islamophobia to ignore what is happening to the Uyghur Muslims in China, perhaps out of fear of Chinese government retribution. Now, to be sure, global, national, and legal regimes and policies attempting to regulate hate speech, and prevent the violent expression of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia globally may not need to account for the legacies of Western ideologies and projects that produced it. Islamophobia may be a product of Western Christian supremacist theological entanglements, as I suggest, but this may not assist national governments and international conventions in creating practical and enforceable laws to prevent vandalism, pogroms, violent mobs, hate speech, and genocides. However, today, we need to understand Islamophobia not merely in terms of those explicit acts of anti-Muslim bigotry, but rather as an embedded feature of our present-day neocolonial racial capitalist system, in which the United States and China extract capital and labor from regions and nations largely inhabited by societies of Muslims, not to mention largely inhabited by the Black, Brown, and Indigenous global majority. It is neocolonial, racial, and Islamophobic. Indeed, governments and international conventions are not equipped to see and address how Islamophobia is now embedded in our modern projects of economic and military supremacy, which appears to be the natural order of things. Quite the opposite, most governments and international conventions unintentionally perpetuate the Islamophobia embedded in economic and military supremacy. If anything, and speaking as a Catholic theologian myself, the project of relating Islamophobia to Western Christian supremacies may have to be left to Christian or Catholic communities and theologians who are seeking to undo the harm caused by legacies of their words and deeds. So what can a Catholic educator, scholar, theologian, institutions do? If Islamophobia has thus patterned our contemporary context, and if Catholic tradition has contributed to this forming, then a Catholic response must not be a religion-blind or apolitical theology of tolerance, inclusivity, theological similarities, and universalism. No. The Catholic response must be a theopolitical response, a political theological response. And this will thus involve not just theological discourse, academic theology, official church teaching, and so on. It must also involve other discourses and context, from parish catechesis to the schools, programs and degrees in international relations, diplomacy, public service, foreign service, economics, and global politics at Catholic institutions of higher ed. Now, to be sure, there's been some excellent work in the field of Catholic-Muslim relations, both in terms of theology and dialogue since Vatican II and into the 21st century. But more needs to be done. Catholic institutions need to collaborate with Muslim scholars and activists through interfaith solidarity against a global political and economic system that relies on supremacy as the only definitive solution to world competition and conflict. The subversion of the contemporary political ideology of Islamophobia remains an issue of justice, and to work for justice requires a liberating praxis, a theology that demands political action in solidarity with Muslims, locally and globally. I am suggesting that Catholic theology with Islam should require the Church's relationship with Islam to center an explicitly anti-Islamophobic theology, and especially global political theology, And this theology needs to trickle down to university departments, programs outside theology departments, including public service, diplomacy, foreign service, and so on. It also needs to trickle down to parish catechesis and homilies when appropriate. Because here's the point. If for 1,400 years, anti-Islamic rhetoric was trickling down from the hierarchy to sermons and street preachers to literary depictions, and then now to the public imagination via the Islamophobia industry, then it's the responsibility of the church to counter that discourse explicitly and directly. If the theologics of the past informed and engendered the present Islamophobic logic and rationality in our civil discourse, national politics, and international systems and policies, then theologics of the present will redeem and reconcile the future. This may be giving theology too much credit, but only if theology is reduced to academic discourse in university towers and Vatican halls, or to the otherwise insightful academic interreligious and comparative theology with Islam that, while necessary, is not enough. But this is not the case when an explicitly anti-Islamophobic, interreligious, political theology which seeks to pervade lay members of Catholic communities and parishes, and even the non-lay members of secondary and higher education. Justice demands an explicit unsaying and undoing of the promulgation of Islamic discourse through Catholics from the Middle Ages to the present. This can be done through a promulgation of the converse today. Supremacist theological entanglements is a knot. Untying that knot will take a lot of work. And in my view, Catholic catechesis and comparative theological exercises need to be part of that work, a work that centers a liberating praxis in seeking to subvert supremacies of any kind. But even more so, untying that knot needs to be the task of Catholic institutions of higher education, even outside departments of theology. As I said before, schools, programs, degrees in international relations, diplomacy, public service, foreign service, economics, and global politics need to remain critical of supremacist systems, even while being forced to work within them. Many more experienced in those fields will be quick to retort, if we don't reign supreme, China will. Do you want that? I understand that. Which is why the knot of Islamophobia and supremacy is quite a tangled supremacist mess. This mess sweeps together Euro-American war on terror rhetoric and logic, anti-Muslim bigotry, and the Islamophobic surveillance state with the plight of the Palestinian people in China's oppression of Uyghur Muslims and their Belt and Roads Initiative, which many argue employs debt trap diplomacy to render Muslim-majority nations colonial client states of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a mess. However, if the story of global Islamophobia reaches back to Christian theological sources, then another story can be told, one that seeks to write a future in which a non-supremacist network of relational solidarity connects peoples to one another. This network, of course, can only be built if our current neocolonial, racial capitalist, and supremacist system can be undone, a system the West exported to the world. To undo the present and imagine a non-supremacist future, Catholic theology will have to learn from global and indigenous decolonial thinkers, in addition to contemporary Muslim activists and theologians who are also seeking a more just and equitable future. But that is a talk for another time. Thank you.
That's a very good talk. And as we lead into questions, I just wonder, and this is an unfair question. I'll begin with that. Perhaps it's, where do you see at this point significant responses coming from the church and or universities? But I'm interested in the former even more than the latter at this point.
Yeah, the church. You know, the question about the church, right? I mean, yeah. In the article version of this talk, I mentioned the fact that even to this day, right, the word Quran and Muhammad do not enter any of the official church documents when they talk about Islam and Muslims. And there's a certain unjust irony, I guess, to that, right? Because if, like I said, for 1,400 years, the word Muhammad in the Quran entered into the vocabulary from Pia Ex Sanctum and all the crusade encyclicals and documents down to sermons and street preachers, if the word Muhammad in Quran was entering into their language in a negative way, and suddenly in the 20th century, we just stop talking about it as if it'll magically go away, that's not going to change anything. You can't, and so in the article version, I do think we need more direct engagement with the Islamic tradition, where they actually use the word Quran, Muhammad, and other aspects. Because, like I said, if 1400 years, they didn't have a problem using it when they were using it pejoratively and negatively, right? Does that make sense? So even that is, I think, and also I do think church teaching is complicated nowadays because the church official documents still rely on sort of effectively still rely on viewing religions as these essential features, like essentialist, right? They're just, Islam is Islam. It begins and ends in these sort of essential boundaries. And they view it totally only as religion. And we know from study, basically from research and a lot of great critical race theory research and Islamophobia research, that the racialization of religion is part of this. And so you have to be able to talk about Islam in a more complicated way, in more nuance about how it is featured in the minds of most people, drawing on the racialization of religion, that process. Did that answer your question mostly?
Yeah, just a slight follow-up. Do you think that what therefore is still preventing us, in many ways, at an official church level, from using that kind of language, is either a conscious or an unconscious clinging to the supremacist approach, and not really able to really let go of that, or at least to, for me, my sense was an interesting one in the sense that it was easy for, in some ways, the church here, I would say the Catholic Church, I'm talking right now because they're different, the Catholic Church, to say that, to accept in some way Judaism, and quote unquote the Old Testament, and be comfortable with that, and feel, and even today when talking to, it says, look how pluralistic, we have these roots, common roots, but Islam can say very much the same thing, that there's common roots. We accept that there was a revelation in the past to both of these traditions, and we accept their prophets. And as I point out very often to audiences, it's not uncommon for Muslims to have their kids named, with, let's say, Arabic versions or whatever versions of Mary, Jesus, etc. It seems to me that although we have had a number of certainly leaders in the church, starting with Pope Francis, opening up in some concrete ways, there's not that ability. I remember a very prominent cardinal, whom I will not mention, who's passed on, at one point made a big step in talking about opening up to dialogue at a social level. But when questioned about that opening up, said, well, I only mean at a social level, because obviously we can't do it as at a theological level. I think that's, but anyway, we can move on to other people's questions. But,
can I just quickly respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, for your first question, that I do think even there's an unconscious clinging to supremacism that, if not doesn't give intentional supremacist theology in teaching and writing, but at least blinds you to seeing it directly. I think the best example of this is the August sort of brouhaha that occurred between Pope Francis's catechesis on Galatians. If anyone is into this, right? He says in the August 11th catechesis on Galatians, very supersessionist language. You can look it up. Some news sources covered it. I wrote a little piece on it. I never really sent it, to place to get it published, but that the only way for the Jewish law only finds fulfillment in Christ. And you're thinking, this is Pope Francis. No, obviously I don't think Pope Francis is supersessionist. Do I think the authors who wrote his catechesis weren't thinking critically enough about what they were offending him? Hey, Pope hears this and he just read it quickly, and and sort of he got the chief rabbi reached out, said this you basically reenacted pre-Vatican II teaching in this catechesis. Later, catechesis the next Sunday, he said, this is just a catechesis, right? And maybe it was a subtle way of saying, you know, I shouldn't have said that, but let's just remember it's just a catechesis. But that's my point. There's nothing that's just a catechesis. Catechesis is a political act. What you say to children or to adults in the form of the church is a political act, right? And you unintentionally perpetuate supremacy, even in little language like that, right? He got called out on, as he should have, right? Because everything he does is coming together. But yeah, I do think there's a subtle clinging always to that. Yeah.
Andrew, let's move to questions.
All right. Yeah, we have a couple of questions, and if anyone's out there and they want to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A, and we will answer your questions live. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. Attendee says, do you feel that present-day supersessionism is a conscious or unconscious social practice for Christian communities and Christian faith leaders?
I think, honestly, it depends which community, which faith. I mean, what I do think it is often an unconscious practice, even for more, you know, for most. I do think it's unconscious. It's conscious for many, right, as well, but those would likely be more on the conservative side. I would say when I read research, I read a document put forth by the Catholic Church, the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. It's a citation from a letter of Paul. And they had some good language there where it said that Jesus's covenant, Jesus's message offers a new dimension of meaning to the Jewish covenant. I thought that was great language. I mean, it's an old document in the 90s, I think, but this new dimension of meaning is a one way where you can sort of think about the relationship with Judaism that isn't supersessionist. It's not the new meaning, it's not the correct one, not the only one, but a new dimension of meaning. It didn't even use a definite article. But despite that great language, I do think accidentally most people are unconscious supersessionists, right? Not necessarily supremacists, but if you think about your catechesis growing up, if you attended it, even of just using, you know, the Old Testament and the new one, right, could have these subtle ways of reproducing supersessionism. That is no longer the case for Vatican II, at least. And so, yeah, I do think it's in there in that case. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, I think Hans Küng, in one of his later writings, referred to the Prophet Muhammad. He framed his conclusion, but you know, the idea of referring to the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, which I think was a very, very rare, at least in my experience, statement.
I will say, I to that end, I commend the recent work of Anna Bonter Moreland. Anna Bonter Moreland, Muhammad Reconsidered, where she does a marvelous job of bringing in, you know, church teaching with Thomas Aquinas on the analogy of language, to trying to refer to the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet in an sense. Anna Bonter Moreland, Muhammad Reconsidered, great book. She does a great first step in sort of like getting this language there. Yeah, I find it fascinating because, you know, in obviously the Islamic in societies of Muslims and caliphates have and ambitions of empire. We obviously the Ottoman Empire, these are, of course, but at least within the tradition, there was a way to have some sort of, if not inclusivism, at least subordinationism, where the other religions were at least part. You could stay Christian, you could stay Jewish, even incorporated other traditions, right? It was at least incorporated in that. Whereas in the early Christian teaching, at least the one that became dominant, right? It was hard to let that be. You were there and you were the only one, everything else is gone, right? It's right. Interesting, yeah.
Andrew.
All right, we have another question. This is from Saeed Khan, and Saeed asks, where can I get access to your article, which is the basis for your talk? How do I access that resource?
Thank you. I like straightforward questions like that. It'll be published in the next issue of Horizons, which is the journal for the College Theology Society, likely in December or January. issue of Horizons, which is the journal of the College Theology Society. Because there are many journals called Horizons, I've learned. But this is the one for the College Theology Society. Next issue, probably January. Yeah, thank you.
All right, if anyone does have questions, please feel to submit. We have another anonymous question here. Have you found in your research any correlation between supersession ideology and theological precepts such as dispensationalism, salvation through Jesus Christ alone?
Yes, and to that, 100%, yes, there's many correlations there. And so some of the unuttered, because you can't cite as you talk in a lecture, some of the work that I've drawn for to connect supersession with Islamophobia is the work by Willie J. Jennings, right? Willie J. Jennings is at Yale. The work of Janine Hill Fletcher is another excellent author. The work of J. Cameron Carter and the recent work of Karen Teal. I think those are the ones you get. And so yes, there's definitely that what happened, especially what Willie J. Jennings argues, is that it was what in the Jewish conception at the time, the Jewish people were sort of bearing God's light, right? They were representations of that. And what happens is in the Christian dispensation, it was the church that replaces the Jewish people in that case, which breeds all sort of supersessionism and supremacy, right? In this case. And so yes, that's definitely there, yeah.
Professor, would you have any questions? It looks like our Q&A has run out.
I wanted to say something, and that is that we are going to have a video of this that will be available, of this talk that will be available and will be posted. And it will be available on the ACMCU website. It'll also be available on the Bridge Initiative website, which is the Bridge is part of ACMCU. The Bridge website is bridge.georgetown.edu. So let me, actually, this was really a first-class presentation. Your article was, but you also measured up. One can't be sure of that when you don't know the person when you're getting to the talk. And we will do our best to really disseminate that and send it out to our list and also to our Facebook list, which is our followers, which is something like 1.1 or 1.2 million people, to try to get it out. And we hope you'll stay in touch with us. Mm-hmm. Or in another way, I hope you'll stay in touch with me. The us is always very, who's the us? But I hope you'll stay in touch with me. Thank you. And we'll look forward to more programs that are of this caliber. Take care.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.